Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming today. My name is Fadi Salami, Al Jazeera Tokyo reporter, and I'm going to do the moderator work for today's session. I'd like to welcome our guest, Dr. Giulio Pugliese. I'm pronouncing right?
Yes, yes.
Italian name. So I would like to welcome him and thank him for visiting us and giving us this opportunity to listen to his ideas about the situation in the area and especially the relationships between Japan and China. This is, as I've just heard, this is his first visit to Japan since 4 years. So let's get the most of his visit today. Dr. Giulio is going to give us a presentation for about 25 minutes. After that, we will have Q&A session for another 30 minutes. During the session, please mention your name and your affiliation before the question. So we're going to start now, and thank you very much. Dr. Giulio, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. I'm honored to be here sitting on the other side of the room because I used to be a student member a while ago at the FCCJ, and I'm very happy to have the privilege to pontificate. I brought my white hat. It's not the papal hat, but I'm from Rome, as you probably have guessed, and I'm very happy to talk about what is the book that came out last year through Palgrave Macmillan, and I co-authored this with a fellow Italian based at Hong Kong University. And as you can see from the colors of the book, you might think that it has Imperial Chinese colors. In fact, it's AS Roma colors, because my co-author is from Juventus, so I tricked him into choosing these colors for the book cover. But jokes aside, time is short, and forgive me for my jet lag, which is evident from the date I've put for today's talk. I will try to give you a broad overview of the book's arguments and give you a broad overview of what I think has been going between Japan and China as a symptom of wider trends. And I'm happy to go into details during the Q&A session, especially with regard to contemporary major developments between these very proud countries. The book will be translated in Korean by the end of the year or beginning of next year. And so hopefully there will also be the chance to have it translated into Japanese. Let's see. The arguments are very straightforward. What I posit is that, together with my co-author, that Japan and China have been playing by the power politics book with increased emphasis since the standoff that was kick-started in 2012 between the Chinese and the Japanese government. And the standoff is symptomatic of broader trends in international politics in the Asia-Pacific. The two very strong and strongly willed leaderships of Abe and Xi Jinping have played by the power politics book on three distinct chessboards. And for Japan, this is a new development, especially Japan playing by the power politics book, not just in the military security, narrowly defined chessboard by increasing its security profile, but also by increasing its political profile and by making good use of its economic leverage for political, if not geopolitical purposes. And this is the money argument that we make in this argument, which has been used, money, so to speak, economic leverage by both countries for political and geopolitical goals. The most interesting part of the book, arguably, is the active use that both governments have made of so-called strategic communications, to use a British understatement. What I, again, as a Roman, not just an Italian, would call propaganda, in a clinical definition that I will provide in a second. And the fact that Japan and the Chinese government have engaged into a propaganda race with the counterpart in mind. And in a nutshell, the argument is that Japan, in a sense, while presenting itself as the bastion of the so-called international liberal order, has actually been socialized little by little into the Chinese power games, into these free distinct chessboards. And so Japan has actually played by the power politics book. And this is a realist story, a story that is characterized by zero-sum, the zero-sum logic of classical realist thinking. Now, the beginning of this conversation has necessarily to start from the broader international trends. And in my and our understanding, me and my co-author's understanding, the broader international trends are premised on China-US relations. Specifically, we are living in an age of major fluctuation in international society. And in fact, the Department of War Studies, where I belong, thrives on crisis. So the more crisis, the better for us, so to speak, the more work for us. It's a very cynical Italian way of thinking. But to be honest, to be jokes aside, the major trend has been a distinct and evident staggering rise and reemergence of China to regional preeminence relative to US relative decline. And US relative decline has translated, arguably from the second part of the Bush Jr. administration, into a less confrontational China policy, into a more accommodative China policy. And this accommodation, to a certain extent, towards China's rise, has translated into Japanese anxieties over the so-called US military shield and US protection vis-à-vis Japan. And so this makes it clear then that the so-called international order, if you want to call it a liberal international order, has been partly premised on a relatively benign US hegemony in East Asia. And this is rapidly changing. Within this broader trend, we witness the ripple effects of strong leadership on both sides, on both the Japanese and the Chinese side. And this has been evident with the very forceful Abe and Xi Jinping administrations, which came to power at roughly the same time. And this is important when the world order is fluctuating. The ripple effects of leadership become much more impactful. This has become evident with the ego-narcissistic personality of Donald J. Trump, who happens to be the President of the United States of America. But it was already very clear with the rise of Xi Jinping and the comeback of Abe Shinzo. And the comeback of Abe Shinzo is indicative because he has been incredibly remarkable. I can share with you articles I have penned on Abe's national security advisor, Yachi Shotaro. I have labeled him Japan's Kissinger, who has been Abe's diplomatic brain already during the first Abe administration in 2006 and 2007. And interestingly enough, the foreign policy team that Abe has cherry-picked has been consistently the same. And he has carried the foreign policy team that was in charge of developing Japan's broader strategy from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the Prime Minister's office and the Prime Ministerial Executive, including the National Security Secretariat. And so this remarkable consistency has translated into a foreign policy that I would define as a foreign policy concerned with China's reemergence to regional centrality and China's advancement into the seas. Now, feel free to ask more detailed questions during the Q&A session. What I will do here in the remainder of my presentation is to give you a sense of how the arguments are developed in the book, and to give you a sense of the almost mirror-like logic to Japan-China relations, and how Japan and China has almost followed the same path in terms of, first of all, of the centralization of power and top-down leadership within their own countries. And secondly, how the foreign policy making machine under Abe and Xi Jinping has pushed into the three chessboards that I have highlighted before. Now, the first step we need to take into account is the centralization of decision-making power within China and Japan. Because of time shortage, I would focus mostly on Japan. And this has been evident in the creation of a new National Security Council, in terms of a new national security strategy, the first ever that Japan has pushed for, and new security legislation. And another important aspect of Abe's centralization of power within Japan has been the politicization of the bureaucratic machine through the so-called Cabinet Personnel Bureau. And this, what you would call Sontaku Seiji, the Sontaku politics, has affected deeply also China. And this is also characterizing, as is evident with the ego-narcissistic, almost obsessive personality of Donald Trump, is also clearly evident also in the United States of America. And so you see clearly that personality and aides close to leaders have become much more important in world politics. And their thinking impacts forcefully also on the bureaucratic machine. And so this is the end of consensual leadership in both China and Japan. What this process has been facilitated, of course, not just by consistent strategic thinking, for all that matters, clearly this has been the case in Japan, but also by the remarkable political longevity of both leaders. As you know, China has removed, the Chinese Communist Party has removed the limit to its General Secretary's mandate, and Xi Jinping has effectively become a core leader with his vote enshrined into the party constitution as of the last National Party Congress. And Abe is likely, in my opinion, to remain in power until 2021. Xi Jinping, remarkably so, has also tightened his grip on the military machine, even more than Mao Zedong to a certain extent. But what is interesting is how this tightening of the grip on the foreign policy machine has translated into actual foreign policy results. In China's case, we have seen a reorganization of the Coast Guard ships, of the Coast Guard forces, and a progressive militarization of the Coast Guard forces. Last but not least, not just with the increase of tonnage, the use of People's Liberation Army Navy ships converted to Coast Guard ships, but also with the latest development, which is the inclusion of the Chinese Coast Guard agency into the People's Armed Police. And so this will be territory for the Central Military Commission, and Xi Jinping will have a tighter control over actions of the Chinese Coast Guards. In Japan's case, while China has increased mostly its domestic capabilities and has advanced what some people have called a hybrid strategy, or here what is more often called a gray zone strategy, to push the envelope in the East and South China Sea, Japan has raised its security profile, as mentioned earlier, with new security legislation, a new reinterpretation of the constitution that enables collective self-defense. But what has been remarkably consistent in Abe's thinking, apart from his desire to change Japan's constitutional framework and to rise Japan's security profile, has been also the need to balance Chinese power through a deeper US-Japan alliance and deepening strategic partnerships with states that are based in the rimlands, in the maritime rimlands around China. And these are Australia, India, and to a lesser extent, some Southeast Asian countries that have been empowered through Coast Guard ships provisions. And so this strategy or vision was enshrined in 2006 already with the Arc of Freedom and Prosperity, which was chanted, it was extolled by then Foreign Minister Aso, but was written de facto by Yachi and his right-hand man Kanehara Nobukatsu, who is still his right-hand man at the National Security Secretariat. And this thinking has been insisted upon immediately after Abe's comeback with the so-called Asian Democratic Security Diamond, and to the latest iteration, which is the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And a consistent desire for Abe to balance China has gone through the so-called quadrilateral intent between Japan, India, the US, and Australia, which would have favored interoperability and a jointness of action and exchange of information between these countries. And what we have seen, in fact, in these 10 years has been a steady increase in military signaling. You might remember that the Malabar exercises, where Japan took place for the first time in 2007, were taking place only days after Wen Jiabao came to Japan to make a historic speech at the Japanese Diet. This was the high mark of the Japan-China détente of 2006, between 2006 and 2008. At the very same time, Japan was pushing for a balancing strategy. And you might say, actually, that Japan, as Japan is doing now, is balancing China so that China would eventually engage Japan, so that China would eventually approach Japan to come to the negotiation table on favorable terms to Japan. And so the reasoning, according to Abe and his advisors, is that China respects strength, and that China would eventually come to terms with Japan only once Japan has insisted upon a resolute stance and has built a set of strategic partnerships that strengthens its position in the international arena. And this thinking is realist thinking. And so military signaling has increased. Japan has now become a routine member, basically, of the Malabar exercises. There was the possibility that Australia might have been included, but this didn't happen. But we see also an increase in military signaling on the Chinese side, with joint exercises every once in a while with Russia, but also with China pushing the boundaries in the East and South China Sea through the progressive militarization of islands, or, well, fake islands, disputed. The Permanent Court of Arbitration has made it clear that these are not islands. But also the fact that China has, for instance, sailed a submarine into the contiguous zone of the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands in January of this year, for the first time ever. Now, time is short, and so I'll try to against my Italian national culture, so to speak, against my Italian genes, I'll try to be in time, and my academic genes as well. So the next important part of this story, of this zero-sum story of Japan-China interaction, has been the one premised on the strategic use of economic levers for political, if not geopolitical, gains. You might remember that the 1990s was a rosy period about stories about globalization and deepening economic interdependence. Japan, as a capital-rich and capital-intensive country, would have benefited nicely with a labor-intensive China. And so the economic complementarity between Japan and China was only promising for stable relationships between these two countries. What has happened, though, with China's entry into the WTO and China's remarkable and sustained economic rise, is that China is now developing economic asymmetries with its neighbors, meaning that China entertains substantial leverage in terms of its economic size vis-à-vis its smaller neighbors. And this includes Japan, which in 2010 has been overcome in terms of GDP. And so this economic leverage can be translated into carrots and sticks, such as the embargo of exports to South Korea, when South Korea decided to deploy the THAAD missile defense system, and boycotts of products from countries that it's not pleased with. And in order to stop or at least slow down this process, Japan's strategic thinking has been the one that you might be all aware about, that is the embrace of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Trans-Pacific Partnership will bring very meager economic gains to the Japanese economy. It will actually improve the economy of the likes like Vietnam or Malaysia. But what will the TPP do is that it will slow down the dependency of these Southeast Asian countries to the Chinese economy. And so by slowing down this sort of like almost natural trend in terms of economic, macroeconomic theory, Japan and like-minded countries will maintain their leverage vis-à-vis Southeast Asian countries and the like. And Abe has clearly been pushy on the TPP, even on the TPP 11, which might even enter into force as legislation has entered into force in Japan. It will be soon also in Canada and Australia. In Mexico, I think it has been passed. And so we only need two more members, two more signatories of the TPP 11 for the TPP to enter into full force. And so it is possible that the TPP 11 will enter into force without the United States of America. Conversely, China has pushed on the Belt and Road Initiative, massive infrastructure and development program, which will eventually link China to countries ranging from Central Asia to Italy and Western Europe. And this, of course, will translate into economic and political leverage, as it has been made clear with Greece, which has provided the Piraeus port to China with a 99-years-old lease, if I'm not mistaken. Greece, in fact, de facto vetoed a strongly worded statement from the EU denouncing the infringement of human rights in China. And so clearly economic levers have been translated into political leverage as far away as Europe. But the main battleground for Japan-China competition through the so-called infrastructure program is Southeast Asia. And make sure you know that the major players in this competition are not the AIIB or the Silk Road Fund, but the Chinese state banks, such as the China State Development Bank. And in the Japanese case, interestingly enough, you also have JBIC, the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, which has been politicized and has been used de facto as a purse for the Abe government, for infrastructure projects in Southeast Asia, and as you might well know in this club, also for the acquisition of the Financial Times, which has been supported by the JBIC and the support of three mega Japanese banks plus other two, for the staggering sum of $1.3 billion. The other important part of the story is how Japan has increased capacity building through a new ODA charter, and this has de facto meant redoubling its focus on national interests, empowering countries such as India, which is now the major recipient of ODA, and also providing Coast Guard ships to Southeast Asian countries that have disputes with China. And so, again, the logic is clear. The logic is to disrupt, in a sense, China's advancement into the seas, because the East and South China Seas are connected, and because Japan needs to play by the power politics book in several fronts. Now, we have 5 more minutes left. We'll move to the most exciting section, in my opinion. But before we do so, I'll give you a definition of propaganda to make it clear that I'm an academic, and maybe the added value of my analysis together with my co-author is that we are in a faraway country that has little political stakes in East Asia. And so our understanding of propaganda is really a clinical understanding of propaganda. This is, by the way, the headquarters of propaganda, where the word comes from. In 1622, the Roman Church, built the Congregatio de Propaganda Fide as part of their counter-reformation efforts against the Protestants, and to, of course, push for missionary activities ranging from South America to East Asia. And propaganda basically meant to propagate the Catholic faith. And in fact, in the beautiful headquarters, which are right next to the Spanish Steps where Audrey Hepburn used to do her Roman holidays, you have Propaganda Street. It's still there, very propaganda. And by propaganda, I basically mean a purposeful use of action, statements, and words that might be truthful or not, to elicit emotions or actions in a recipient audience. And Japan and China have been playing by the propaganda playbook more distinctively since 2012. Again, this is an interesting story because if you think about the 1990s, it was all about soft power, right? It was all about the need for public diplomacy and soft power. We're entering a stage, not just in world politics, not just in East Asia, but also, and more so actually, in Europe, where message manipulation, control over information, and the simplification of the story becomes more important. And the government has an active role to play into this story. And so the first part, perhaps what we should mention, is the simplification of the narrative. And this is a strategic narrative that Japan and China have insisted upon since the Senkaku Diaoyu standoff. We see a good China versus a bad Japan and vice versa. And we see China insisting on the history issue, while Japan has doubled down on universal values and on the need to preserve, as you are aware, a free and open Indo-Pacific, the rule of law, the international liberal order. But this, of course, is a simplification, right? And this plays well into the political book of the Abe and Xi governments. I won't go into details, and I'm very happy for you to ask me about it. But perhaps a few things that you should probably know about is that Japan has spent substantial amount and increased by 300% its budget on public diplomacy in 2015. This was when the public budget increased by a meager 3 or 4% all in all. So 300% versus 4% is a substantial amount. And you see this in new institutions, such as the Japan House in London, and now soon to be opened also in Brazil and Los Angeles, if I'm not mistaken, or San Francisco. And also by funding to think tanks, to academia. In fact, my position at King's College London was originally funded by the Japanese government, but since I secured new money from the British Academy, I am now free from what used to be a meta project. I was basically studying myself, in a sense. And then, of course, you have new publications devoted, and new publicity devoted to the contested and disputed islands. What you also have, interestingly enough, is that you have propaganda in the narrow sense that has been pushed by Japan. And this is a scoop that the Sunday Telegraph, the Sunday Times has made a year ago, where a London-based think tank got, on a monthly basis, money from the Japanese embassy to write anti-China commentary. For instance, on Hinkley Point, China could switch off your lights. And this commentary would be published on major English dailies, but it wouldn't be signed by the think tank. It would be signed by authoritative proxies, because the best propaganda is where you don't see the government hand. The best propaganda is where, it also is, of course, is honest propaganda, but the best one is where you actually use proxies that you trust to convey a government message. So Japan has also engaged in propaganda, negative propaganda, and this is a new development in Japan, through authoritative proxies. Now, where are we now? And this probably I'll need a couple of minutes, if it's okay, because this will lead also to the Q&A. We were left with some hope in 2014 after the frosty handshake between Abe and Xi Jinping on the fringes of the APEC summit in November. And eventually détente seems to come to a realization right now between Japan and China, as China has made it clear that it wants to engage Japan. China has hastened its embrace of Japan by pushing for a Japan-China economic dialogue in March, and China has pressured Japan to have it soon. China has also pressured South Korea to have, the economic dialogue was in April, to have a trilateral dialogue in May, and Moon wasn't sure that he needed to come to Japan 1 year after his inauguration. But China wanted badly to come to Japan as soon as possible for the trilateral, and then eventually for Li Keqiang's state visit around Japan. And Abe has escorted Li Keqiang, Premier Li Keqiang. Abe has also vowed cooperation on the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. We are still waiting for substantial policies and substantial cooperation between Japan-China companies in Southeast Asia devoted to sustainable development. But why are we experiencing this now? In my opinion, we have to go back to square one. We are experiencing this now because China-US relations are changing. There is a growing consensus in the US, not just in the Trump administration, but also among Democrats, that China has de facto cheap road on America's engagement of the PRC. And there are mounting frictions on the maritime domain in the South China Sea, on Taiwan, where the Trump administration seems to push within the boundaries of the One China policy, and we will see now the inauguration of the American Institute in Taiwan in September as well, and that will be big news, with also high-ranking delegates attending. But we also see trade frictions between China and the US. And this is the driver of China's charm offensive, not just vis-à-vis Japan, but also vis-à-vis India, vis-à-vis South Korea. But we need to wait and see. This is a tactical détente. China knows that time is on its side. And I'm very happy to go into deeper details of what will be the key deliverables, in all likelihood, of this détente. And I think I have abused already a couple of minutes of your patience. I'm very happy to go to a Q&A session, but make sure to order this book also on, on Amazon. Thank you very much.
Dr. Pugliese, thank you very much for this presentation. So now I'm going to open the session for Q&A, and please raise your hand, say your affiliation, and please, if you could make the question as short as possible so we could have more questions. So please.
Martin Kölling, Handelsblatt from Germany. Talking about détente, on Sunday we had the RCEP meeting here in Tokyo, and the participants basically concluded to try to come to a conclusion of a framework agreement by year's end. So I would like to know from you what you think of this kind of free trade agreement that is kind of competition or addition to the TTP, how this all fits into this power game.
Shall I pick up a question? So answer straight ahead. Yes. Okay. Yes, excellent question. So RCEP is particularly broad, and Japan has made sure that it would get broader. So Japan has aimed actually at diluting RCEP by including India, for instance. And by including India, you make sure, and China, you make sure that the type of free trade agreement that will be signed will not be as strict as the TPP, or as the incoming EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement. If I'm not mistaken, Abe will travel to Brussels soon. And then, of course, yes, there is a linkage. And the linkage plays well also in terms of trade frictions that are mounting, not just between China and the US, and Japan has a stake in China-US trade frictions because of regional production networks and economic complementarity with China and Japanese companies in China and whatnot. But also in terms of the need for Japan to find its leverage, to quote Trump, when it engages into the bilateral dialogue with the Trump administration. Because Trump has made it clear that it wants to engage into a bilateral economic dialogue that leads to a bilateral free trade agreement. So what we have here, I think, is that Japan is trying to increase its leverage and also make sure that that it pushes for widely shared international rules that regulate global trade and investment, more importantly. And this is clear from the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, which is extremely comprehensive, and we are talking about de facto the second and third largest economy, if you count the EU as an economy. And so it will have major ripple effects, more than our CEP, I think. I hope that answers your question. What about it? Well, China, of course, will be part of our CEP, but China will be left out of TPP, and there is a broad concern also in the EU, speaking of EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, of Chinese investments. And so there will be a screening agency that will be launched. There will be a screening legislation that will be launched in the EU. So I think that what we are seeing is still more competition more than anything else, because RCEP will still take time to see it actually coming into real implementation.
Okay, another question. Okay, I'm going to ask a question until somebody raises another question. Dr. Giulio, you know now there is too many changes in the Korean Peninsula after the North-South Korean summit and the Trump-Kim summit. And many people are saying now that maybe the US troops are not going to be as large, the US bases in this region as before. So do you think this would benefit China and would be against Japan's interests? If it happens, of course.
Right. Yes, if it happens, that's a big if, because Carter also, Jimmy Carter also came to office with the same idea of decreasing US engagement in the peninsula in South Korea, but eventually didn't really materialize. So we will have to see. Certainly what is probably happening in the head of President Trump's mind is that he sees US troops in South Korea as a cost, and he also wants to use the threat of retrenchment as leverage for concessions on the economic and trade side from either South Korea or, in this case, Japan, because of course he's aware that both countries will be very concerned. And so one key quote of Trump's deal-making, the Art of the Deal book, is that you need to use your leverage. And Trump hasn't shied away from making use of the US security shield for economic gains. And so basically what the Don-Shinzo relationship amounts to, you might say sometimes, is that Japan has to pay protection money in a sense, and Don stands for Don Vito Corleone in a sense, if you want to make a cynical joke. But we will see whether this is actually really possible. Not least because as things stand now, we have the latest news that North Korea has de facto progressed its nuclear and missile capabilities programs. And of course, as you say, China has been a winner so far because its freeze for freeze proposal, meaning no more missile nuclear tests on the North Korean side, have been met with a freeze of military exercises on the other side. So surely, yeah, but we will have to wait and see how the situation develops. And by the way, North Korea is not my specialty, so, but feel free to ask questions.
Okay. Question, please.
Siegfried Knittel, freelancer from Germany. You talked about the competition in Southeast Asia. It will be the main competition. But if you see what China spends in Southeast Asia, what India and Japan spends on Southeast Asia for infrastructure help, is they are both countries really competition to China?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. Actually, yes, to the extent that Japan has substantial economical, financial firepower, you see the promotion of high-quality infrastructure investment funds that even just rhetorically are $10 billion higher than China's proposed funding. So China proposed a 100 infrastructure and development fund going to Southeast Asia, and the Japanese equivalent, I think it was announced in 2015, amounted to 110. Now, what we see, and with the addition of quality infrastructure and sustainable development, which is another key word, what we see actually is that China has made a lot of rhetorical promises also in terms of sum that would have been given to Southeast Asian recipient countries, but it hasn't actually materialized. You see projects such as railway projects in Indonesia that have been won by the Chinese first, and then eventually the Japanese were responsible for it, but became responsible for it. And so actually the situation is still very fluid. But certainly, the reasoning on China's side, and the reason why I think that the détente is tactical on China's side, is precisely because China thinks that time is on its side. Because China is still experiencing a 6.5, nominally 6.4 GDP growth. And so certainly, as you say, money-wise, time is on China's side. And what Japan can do is to gang up with like-minded countries. But in terms of infrastructure exports, certainly an oversupply, exporting oversupply capacity, Japan is in a better position than the US and Australia, for instance, or India for this matter, which is still a developing country. So yeah, I agree. But this is not yet the story. So we are at the power transition period where Japan is relenting and slowing down China's ascendance.
Please. Please. Next question.
Hello, thanks for your talk. Daniel Hurst, a freelance journalist. Just to follow up what you just said about the détente being tactical, how long do you see it lasting? Or what would be the trigger for that reducing? And secondly, Japan's still working out how to engage with Belt and Road projects. They say they'll look at it on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
How do you see Japan being able to engage with this initiative on terms that are favourable to Japan? Thank you.
Excellent questions, and they're actually related in a sense. So, to answer part of the first question, the understanding is that Abe will visit China soon, hopefully maybe by the end of the year, so that Xi Jinping will be able to reciprocate and visit Japan in time for the G20 that will take place in Japan. And on the fringes of the G20, eventually there will be a heads of state reception or a heads of state visit of Japan, a bilateral, where in all likelihood Japan and China will showcase to the world a fifth key document governing Japan-China relations. Every time the Chinese president, head of state, visits Japan, or they have state visits of this caliber, there is a major diplomatic document that governs Japan-China relations that is unveiled. And so we will have a fifth important document governing Japan-China relations, which will be particularly important on lofty principles, which the Chinese government is keen on, usually. But there needs to be also a deliverable, right? There needs to be something to showcase that Japan-China relations are back on track. And the best way to do that is cooperation to a certain extent on the Belt and Road Initiative. This is my understanding, this is my analysis. It will probably be rhetorical, it will probably be not particularly deep cooperation, but it will certainly do what? It will build up Xi Jinping's face, because the Belt and Road Initiative is Xi Jinping's belt. It is his initiative, as to the extent that it's part of the new party constitution. And what will happen is that Xi Jinping will be able to sell this to his own people. Japan has accommodated to us. Japan now takes part to the Belt and Road Initiative. What might likely happen is that Japan will push for specific projects involving Japan-China joint ventures or Japan-China private corporations operating in a third country, so Southeast Asia, for instance, on a project that showcases the sustainable and technologically advanced part and energy efficient part of Japanese development exports. And so it will be a showcase for both governments of the kind of collaboration that Japan can do also to the Belt and Road. But it will, in all likelihood, be a minority showcase case. It will be a very small, probably, set of projects that will be launched. I don't see Japan, for instance, becoming part of the AIIB. What might happen is that Japan will collaborate through the ADB and through the World Bank. But still, we get rhetoric that through the ADB at present that denounces the risk of a debt trap in recipient countries. What might happen as well is that Japan might enter the AIIB, but to get then quotas that avoid China having a veto power within the AIIB, so to diffuse it. But it's unlikely that that will happen, I think. The other question is, how long will this last? To add to this point, one interesting cleavage within Japan is the one within the Prime Minister office. You have people like the Chief Secretary of the Prime Minister, called Imai, who is pushing more and more on, apparently, on rapprochement with China to profit from the economic engagement of the second largest economy. Along with Imai, the Secretary General of the LDP, Nikai, has also been particularly keen in engaging China. But these voices, in my opinion, are still minority voices. The key decision makers still sit at the National Security Council. I think Yachi is still, and the suspicions that Yachi holds, and you can look at my articles here to get a sense of the thinking of foreign policy elite under Abe, the first two articles especially, of China, are still playing a particularly, if you are unable to access it, please feel free to send me an email. These people's thinking are still particularly important, I think, in Japan's China policy. And the suspicions of the Belt and Road Initiative are still particularly important and play a major role. Now, how long will this détente or semblance of détente hold for? Well, it depends pretty much on the state of US-China relations. If US-China relations keep being quite contentious, it is likely that China will continue its charm offensive. It might be possible that Japan gets embroiled in a Taiwan crisis of some sort, even if it's a pro forma one, not a military crisis proper in a narrow sense, or in the South China Sea. But I don't see this happening yet. So the signals are quite good for the moment, not least because Abe needs a diplomatic success story, even if it's a semblance of a diplomatic success story, to win the LDP presidential elections in September. And to eventually win new elections to confirm his mandate and the LDP's mandate in the parliament, in the Diet. So I think that domestic politics also play a role in keeping up momentum for the semblance of détente between Japan and China.
Okay, please.
Murakami, advisor to the international edition of the New York Times here. I think what you have just finished saying, that Abe needs sort of détente situation as he stands now. What I'm trying to ask you is, détente could lead to a good, peaceful relationship and a peaceful situation in this part of the world. Détente also means conveniences that's required on the both parts, particularly the Chinese, who are going to face a trade war with the United States, who has to support North Korea giving up nuclear weapons, which was a headache for the United States. That's going to be taken care of on the part of Trump administration so that he could put more emphasis on his Taiwan
Please,
policy.
if you could make the question.
Yes, my view is that China's policy is the reverse of Greater China civilization and the marginalization of Japan. And that's what they are doing right now. Because you have to realize the Abe is going to put the Aegis ashores, 2 of them. That's against China. Abe is creating a small aircraft carrier. That's against China. So my view is, and I'm asking you if you would agree to me, that a détente is a superficial thing on the process to the final showdown between the 2 powers in this part of the world.
Yeah. Thank you very much. This is a very important point, and it ties back to some readings I've made recently, authoritative readings. One is by the president of the National Defense Academy, Kokubun Ryosei, who is a sinologist, and argues that what we have experienced throughout Chinese politics since the 1980s especially, is that you have rival factions and intra-party factional struggles where opposing factions, especially the hawkish ones, have used the anti-Japan card to weaken the mainstream. Jiang Zemin happened to be mainstream and anti-Japan, also for personal reasons. And after Jiang Zemin, his faction has played a very important role in weakening, according to Kokubun, in weakening not just Hu Jintao, which was responsible for engaging Japan, but also Xi Jinping. And so Kokubun says that now that Xi Jinping is clearly in command following the past National Party Congress, Xi Jinping now is able to get rid of Jiang Zemin and the Shanghai faction people in the propaganda bureau, for instance, and to more comfortably engage Japan. So this is the Chinese domestic politics reasoning. Miyamoto Yuji, former ambassador to China, recently wrote a book where he says that China is going under a period of self-reflection, where China's hyper-nationalism, what you mentioned, the China dream, so to speak, of rejuvenating the Chinese nation and being again the regional hegemon, has met policy failures here and there, ranging from South Korea to Japan to its American policy, and to a certain extent also in Southeast Asia. And so now there is a self-examination period where China is trying to actually come to terms and be more accommodative, more moderate in its foreign policy. I think actually, and I agree with you, that this is not the case. I understand Xi Jinping as a nationalist who has a tight grip on the military and who is also particularly enamored with the idea of securing Chinese maritime interests in the East and South China Sea. And so this will be a constant. And even if we see a decreasing number in terms of number of entries in Chinese contiguous waters around the Senkaku Diaoyus or the territorial waters, we see a steady crescendo in numbers of ships that are being sent. And the procurement of Coast Guard ships is, of course, is ongoing in China. And so, clearly, this is a process. And time on the military side, or if you want to call the Coast Guard's a constabulary force, also on that side, is on China's side. This is the reasoning of the Xi Jinping administration. And that's why I think that, yes, there is still a strong suspicion of Abe, I would say, especially. And there is a willingness to secure China's interests in its immediate neighborhood. And of course, China's dream is just the opposite of a Chinese nightmare. And the Chinese nightmare is, in a sense, the century of humiliation and the brutal invasion of China by foreign powers, including Japan. So clearly it reinforces itself, anti-Japan nationalism. It reinforces, in a sense, the China dream. It's like yin and yang in a way. But to be fair, the propaganda and the rhetoric in China on Japan has improved. But new institutions have been in place since 2012. And so now we have a Nanjing Massacre Memorial Day that every year takes place on December 13. And Xi Jinping visited Nanjing on December 13 last year. He didn't make a speech, but he was there. So clearly, we can't see a real process of trust building yet, even if you have signs of a budding detente. And so, yes, I would say that it remains to be seen whether we will have what you define as a peaceful situation in the future. But the my understanding is still quite pessimistic, not least because Chinese domestic politics will also become tougher in years to come, I think.
Okay, just last short question, please. Thank you.
My name is Hiro Krishna, a former editorial writer for the Kokumin Shimbun. A freelance now. We have abducted issue.
Ah, yes,
right.
Abduction issues.
Right, and then that is related to China's influence over North Korea, and I'm concerned about China itself in terms of human rights, respect. Okay, so how would you comment on improvement of the human rights in China, especially not Han-Chinese, but for those suppressed people like Uyghur people or Southern Mongolian people and Tibetan people and all that?
Thank you. Well, I think that the situation and the prospects are bleak also on that front. Not least because we have a U.S. administration that clearly is not interested in human rights. We have a more repressive Chinese police state. We have an incredibly repressive system in Xinjiang that includes profiling, including, if I'm not mistaken, genetical profiling. And this is particularly troublesome. I think that this is something that will not improve through external pressure. Not least because we are not interested in human rights, because we are playing by the power politics book more and more. And so it is important to remark that it's not just China that is exporting its authoritative model. It's the fact that we are playing by China's game that reinforces this trend. And so when China invests in the Philippines to buttress up and to strengthen Duterte, the next politician to visit the Philippines is Abe, who makes similar promises and visits also Duterte's hometown. And Duterte, I understand, as a particularly troublesome leader as well, a strong man who is responsible for equally scary domestic politics. And so, yes, I think that it doesn't bide well. Not least because, as we've seen with the US-North Korean summit, neither the South Korean nor the American government have been particularly keen in discussing human rights infringements in North Korea. So I am not particularly sanguine about development, unless it's domestic. Which means major developments in the making if, say, the Chinese economy falters, perhaps.
Okay, with this question, we conclude this press conference. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for Dr. Giulio Pugliese. And this is a small token from the club.
Oh,
it's an honorary membership. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hope to see you again. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.